Welcome to the next installment in lectures for the American Economic History course online here at Rutgers University. Today we are going to go over Chapter 3 from your textbook, and we're discussing the colonies on the eve of the Revolution. And there's a couple of things that I think that are very important that relate to this particular chapter. Number one, make sure that we have some type of understanding about the changing sources and the growth patterns of population within the U.S. colonies. One of the things we're particularly going to look at is the changing importance of slavery in the colonies. Very important to discuss. Also, we're going to take a look at this notion that the colonists felt that there was a shortage of money, and we're going to take a look at how the colonies adopted different strategies to alleviate the problem of this money shortage. And we'll also take a look at the modern perspective is whether or not there truly was a shortage of money in the colonies. So first we're going to take a little bit of a look at population. Number one, what are the sources of immigration in the United States? Make sure that you remember, obviously, that there was a very diverse sourcing of free workers or free immigrants into the colonies. But the number one thing to remember is that England, by far, had the greatest proportion of individuals who were coming to the colonies prior to the Revolution. As you can see here, estimates place that at about 61%. So that's something that you should keep in mind, that the English were the greatest source of free immigrants to the colonies during that time period. It's important because we're going to see that this has to do with how important trade is with England prior to the Revolutionary War and even after the Revolutionary War, because we had a shared language, shared customs, etc. Realize also that we have a great deal of immigrants coming from Scotland and Ireland prior to the Revolution. All right. And we also have the Germans and Dutch being highly represented. Also realize that not the only source of population increase wasn't just from free individuals, but we have an influx of slaves coming into the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. Estimates have placed somewhere between 10 and 15 million slave imports between 1500 and 1865. Remember, this is to the Americas, which includes South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. So the number that was imported into the actual U.S. colonies, even to this day, is subject to debate. So we're not going to be too concerned with the exact number, but I just want you to be aware of the importance of the import of slave labor into the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. And let's take a look at how important actually the slave population was. If we take a look at the U.S. population in 1790, we can see that almost 20% of the population was composed of non-whites, and we could assume that most of these are slaves. So you can see that a great deal of the population in the colonies was a slave population. Here in 1790, after the Revolutionary War, roughly 20% of the population of the United States consisted of slaves. Now, this table contains quite a bit of information, but the thing I really want you to concentrate when looking at this table is, number one, take a look at the percentage of the population that was black, slave population, and see how that increased over time. So you can see that obviously in 1610 there are no slaves in the colonies. The colonies were just being started. But by 1630, you can see that roughly 1.3% of the population was of slave origin. If we move to 1650, that grows to 3.2%. 1680, 4.6%. So you can see prior to 1700 that slave labor is growing in importance in the colonies of North America. By 1700, we see a dramatic increase in the percentage of the population that is black/slave. All right, just in a 20-year time period from 1680 to 1700, it increases from 4.6% to 11.3%. So I want you to be aware, number one, of that large jump that occurs from 1680 to 1700. It becomes much more important to the colonies and the economy of the colonies, late 1600s to 1700s. And then again, we see that we see a continual increase going all the way up to the 1780s. We see that in 1720 it jumps to roughly 15%. 1750 it jumps to 21%. And then after 1750, we start to see the percentage of the population that's black/slave. And the reason why I'm saying black/slave is that there were some free black individuals in the colonies during this time period, but they were in the minority. So I just want you to be aware of the fact that there were some freed slaves living in the colonies, but their proportion was quite small. So this number, in essence, is measuring the slave population, although it's not a perfect measure. After 1750, we actually start to see the importance of slavery start to decline. 1750, we see it's at 21%, and that drops to a roughly 20% in 1760, and then rebounds in 1780 to roughly 21%. And then the numbers we saw from that previous table, 1790, it dropped to about 19%. So I want you to realize that in the stages, if there are any questions that relate to the stages, that slavery was growing in importance as it relates to percentage of population up to 1720. Growing up until 1750. And after 1750, it started to decrease. Slaves as a proportion of the population started to decrease. Not that the slave population was itself decreasing, but we were seeing more free individuals migrating to the United States during that time period. So a couple of things to remember from this is that big jump in the importance of slavery in the colonial economy occurs from 1680 to 1700 when it went from 4.6 to 11.3%. I'm not concerned with you knowing these actual numbers, just realize that the big jump in proportion of the population that was slave in the colonies is from 1680 to 1700. The other thing I want you to realize from this is that it continually grew in importance up until 1750. And then after 1750, we actually started to see a decline. So make sure you're familiar with that the largest change in the importance of slaves in the colonial population occurred from 1680 to 1700, that there was a continual increase in the proportion of the population that was slaves in the colonies up until 1750. And after 1750, we started to see a consistent decline in the proportion of slaves in the population. Now we're going to take a little bit of a look here again at per capita wealth, and in particular, not just the per capita wealth, but the distribution of where the composition of that wealth. So if we take a look again, we can see that the South is the wealthiest part of the colonies in 1774. All right. So it's wealthier than the middle colonies, and that's from the previous estimates that we took a look at. What we talked about previously holds, that New England was the least wealthy. Wealth started to increase as we went to the middle colonies, and then we had the wealthiest portion of the colonies was the South. So this information is still consistent, that the further south you went in the colonies, the wealthier it generally got to be. But the interesting thing to take a look at this composition of wealth is how pretty much consistent the composition of wealth across the different colonies except for slaves. So if we take a look at, for example, land, we can see that the importance of land is relatively the same across all 13 colonies and then the individual sections, New England, middle colonies, and the South. For all 13, it was roughly 25.6 pounds sterling. If we take a look at New England, it's roughly 26. Again, the middle colony's 26, and in the South, 25. So they're roughly equivalent to one another across the regions of the colonies, between New England, middle colonies, and the South. And you can see by looking at this that this holds fairly consistency, except for livestock, which was much less important in New England, which makes perfect sense, as we talked about in a previous lecture, that the farms in New England were subsistence farming. So you're in all likelihood in subsistence farming, you're going to see less livestock, as you're not engaging in farming for commercial purposes, only in self-sufficiency. All right. Now, the big difference is if you take a look at slavery, and as we talked about before, there was a difference in the composition of slaves among the colonies, but it also, that is indicative of different composition in terms of wealth. All right. For the 13 colonies, if you take a look at the colonies as a whole, 9.1 pounds sterling, sorry, I almost forgot what the denomination was during that time period, was 9.1. And if we take a look at in New England, we can see it's almost non-existent in New England, which makes sense because remember when we took a look at the distribution of slaves along the colonies, that New England, roughly some of the colonies, only 1% of the population was slaves. So it makes sense that the proportion of wealth that was due to holding slaves would be insignificant. Middle colonies, we can see again, it's quite small, 1.6 pounds sterling. So it's quite small. But take a look at the South. A great deal of the wealth of the South was tied up in slaves. Roughly 33% of right around 30% of the wealth of the South was tied up in slavery. And you can see in the middle colonies, this is going to be roughly 4%, and here 1% at the most. So again, this is just reiterating the importance of slavery to the economy of the southern colonies and how less important it was across New England and the middle colonies. And also, let's take a look at, for example, if we subtract these out. Let's take these numbers out of the equation here. If we take out slaves, and let's just say, let's calculate per capita wealth exclusive of slaves, we can see that New England's going to fall to 36.4 pounds sterling. We're going to see that the middle colonies is going to fall roughly to 40 pounds sterling, and that the southern colonies are going to fall to 36.3. So you can see that if we were to eliminate slavery from this calculation, the wealth that from holding slaves, that this distribution of wealth along the colonies pretty much becomes completely equal. So I just want you to realize that, and also realize that those numbers that I just gave you are incomplete in the fact that they understate the numbers, because southern per capita wealth would fall even further because those freed slaves would now be part of the denominator. So this would fall even further. So I just want you to realize, number one, that if you exclude the wealth in the form of slave holdings out of these per wealth, the private wealth per capita out of this, in essence, you end up with almost a completely even distribution of wealth between the 13 colonies, between New England, the middle colonies, and the South. Now what we're moving into is this discussion about whether or not there was a shortage of money. And this is something that's been hotly debated amongst climatricians. Climatricians are individuals who use statistical techniques to look at historical events. And in order to do that, we have to go over a basic review of what the quantity theory of money is. And here's the quantity theory of money. The money supply times velocity is equivalent to the price level and output. All right, this is true because it is true. All right, velocity, if we think velocity is just how frequently a a particular, let's say in modern times, a dollar gets spent any given year. So for example, if we have $1 billion in the money supply and each dollar gets spent roughly 5 times, the value of economic output will be equal to $5 billion. All right. So the thing is, you have to realize that there's this equivalency that occurs. So for example, if one side of this equation goes up by 10%, this portion of the equation has to also go up by 10%. So if the money supply goes down by 10%, we should expect the price level to go down by 10%, or production to go down by 10%, or this P times Q to go down by 10%. The assumption most economists make is that velocity is constant in the short run. In the long run, there are adjustments to how frequently money is spent, depending on different situations. But the assumption is in the short run, this is constant. So that if M changes, this is going to have to change by an equivalent amount. All right, so realize that, and also realize that colonists and many historians, now I'm not talking about economic historians, I'm talking about historians, that there was a shortage of species. So make sure you understand that difference, that when colonists and historians were talking about what was going on in the colonial period, they refer to money exclusively as gold and silver coin. And remember, economists have a much broader definition of what constitutes money. So make sure that that's one thing that you realize when you take this out of this course. When people, if you hear anybody talking about shortage of money in the colonial period, make sure you remember that colonists were referring to a shortage of hard currency, of specie, of gold and silver. They weren't constituting any other forms of currency that economists would include in the definition of money. All right, this species shortage led to two important developments in the colonies. The colonies realized that they could use paper money to facilitate trade. So that they realized that this paper money, this quote unquote fiat currency, F-I-A-T-E, fiat means it's legal tender by government fiat, by government statement. The government dictates that this is legal tender and you have to accept that. All right, so they realized that in order to augment quote unquote money, or to deal with the shortage of specie, they could issue pieces of paper that would be substitutes for money. Also, the Revolutionary Congress chartered a note issuing bank, and this is in essence the genesis of the American commercial banking system. So in order to finance the Revolutionary War, the Revolutionary Congress chartered a stock company that actually was a note issuing bank, and it's the first examples of a commercial bank with governmental backing in the history of the United States. Now, remember I told you previously that money to an economist has a different definition than most people think. And an economist, there are 3 or 4 different things that functions that must be performed in order for something to constitute money. First, it has to be a medium of exchange. Medium of exchange just means that people will accept it in exchange for goods and services. So you can take whatever that item is, whether it's paper money, coin, tobacco certificates. Maryland had a tobacco inspection act, and that those notes actually circulated for currency for a period of time. As long as individuals will accept them in exchange for goods and services, that's what it's a medium of exchange. So when you take $1 or $2 and go to the Starbucks and buy a coffee, they take that paper money from you and they give you a coffee in exchange. That means it's a medium of exchange. Unit of account just means that prices are denominated in that particular money, in that currency. So when you go to the Starbucks, something's listed as $2, $3, $4, etc. If you go to the cafeteria, if you go to the Wawa, the items that you are trying to purchase are denominated in that particular currency. In our example, it's in the dollar. So you can go in and buy a hoagie for $4.99. So items are denominated in that currency. A store of value. Store of value means that the currency or the money itself maintains its purchasing power over time. It doesn't have to maintain its entire purchasing power over time, but it has to maintain its purchasing power over time. What that means is if you take a $20 bill and you let it sit in your room, and next year you find that $20 bill and you forget about it, you can still go out and buy stuff. So store of value is that it maintains its purchasing power over time. Like I said, it doesn't have to maintain 100% because there is inflation. That $20 bill that you put in your room this year will, in all likelihood, buy less stuff next year, but it'll maintain most of its value. And finally, it has to be accepted as a deferred payment mechanism, meaning that if somebody willingly wants to purchase something from you, you will accept payment in that currency sometime in the future. So, for example, if I agree to sell you something a year from now, that it's a standard that you will accept that dollar or that currency system in the future as well as today. Realize also that there are many different things that have functioned as money, particularly in the colonies. For example, there are examples of, colonial administrators being paid in animal skins, or them being paid in tobacco. So realize that this is what is referred to as commodity money. There's some type of commodity that's associated with. You can sell the tobacco, you can sell the animal skins. That's what I mean by commodity money. Also, that things that were called wampum, these were actually Native American polished shells that were on strings that were actually being accepted as currency. So they were polished strings. They were also rocks that had holes bored in them, etc. And they were also used for some time in some of the colonies, particularly at the beginning stages of colonial development. They were used as money. All right, there's just a repeat for you. Have to fix that later.